chair of our next session is Dr. Morgan Bazilian. Dr. Bazilian is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis. The Institute conducts leading-edge research and provides objective and credible data, tools, as well as analysis to guide global energy investment and policy decisions. The Institute is partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as well as some other universities across the country. Previously, Dr. Bazilian was the special advisor to the Director General for UNIDO. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Morgan Bazilian.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and Lakshman, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I applaud you for putting something like this on in the middle of Colorado and in the middle of the United States. I've been in Colorado now for 4 weeks, and you don't often see an event focused on things outside of our direct line of vision, so thank you for that. We're going to look at, we're in session 2, we're going to run till about 1 o'clock, or roughly that. We have 2 speakers. They're each going to give roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A before we go to lunch. I'm really pleased we have 2 very distinguished speakers here. We're going to start with Jason, who's on the far right there, looking at social and economic findings, and then Paul is going to look at what it means to live without certain aspects of infrastructure and services. You can take my word for it that they're both very distinguished. They have very interesting bios in the back of your sheet here. Jason is an attorney and an adjunct professor, and Paul is a professor and a director of a center here on campus. And I would recommend to you to look at their more detailed biographies, but with their acquiescence, I've decided not to spend our time here reading through each one of them. So Jason, why don't you start us off, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. And I want to start off by saying thank you to Dr. Guruswamy. The ideas that I'm about to present are mainly guided by him, and he's, through the course of my legal career, kind of guided me and been a mentor and a guru to me. This is a unique and special opportunity. I also want to thank Ms. Feimster, who's with us, who helped me do some of the work on this. My limited role in this was to do the work, which is oftentimes my job. I wanted to start out, though, by showing you some pictures. The picture on the left is a tractor that I used to drive, not the one that I used to drive, but a tractor that I used to drive as a child. It's a John Deere 3020. And it's got a cultivator unit on it. And on our farm that I grew up on, we had a cultivator unit just like that one. And the reason that we had it was because my mother had decided that when my parents were going to farm, that they were going to farm without the use of pesticides, which required a return to more of the early farming techniques, the appropriate and sustainable farming techniques that had been applied in the United States up until that time. Those techniques of farming had been completely forgotten in 1970 and 1965. They had almost been completely replaced by chemical agriculture. And the only place my father learned about the use of cultivation to control weeds when growing corn and soybeans and other things was by going to talk to a very, very old man who was then in his 80s, who taught him how to farm the way they used to farm before there were pesticides. So the picture in the middle is a row of corn after it's been cultivated. Notice it does a pretty good job of eliminating weeds. And the picture on the left is an appropriate and sustainable energy technology that's being applied in another world, in another place. It's a form of a cultivator that's using the things that folks have there. They've created weight to be able to dig into the ground by filling up barrels with water. And they're drawing the cultivator with oxen. but it works. And that's kind of the point. So we came up with and we analyzed really there's some issues to address. There's equity, which has been beautifully addressed earlier today. There's questions of poverty, which have been touched on, questions of the need for development. There's also questions in this relating to climate change that really haven't been discussed very much. And so looking at these issues together, we thought, well, what about these ASATs, these appropriate and sustainable energy technologies? Can we justify their potential from a theoretical perspective, and not one that's just focused on one theory, but is intentionally kind of cross-cutting across different modes or descriptions of why things might work or not work? We thought, sure, we could. So we dreamed up an analysis, and we said, we're lawyers, so we probably ought to look at legal philosophy. And we took a look at legal philosophy before we decided to go off and practice thermodynamics at law. But we decided to do a little bit of that too, and some economics at law as well. And the question really that we've got is, when you look at the analysis addressing these issues, do ASATs provide a better way forward for providing energy that works, useful energy? So just a brief look at the issues together. As we've discussed, there's more than 1.3 billion people without access to technologies that make useful work. As Dr. Jumkela pointed out today, in Africa, there are countries with abundant energy resources, but the people in those countries don't have access to tools that translate energy resources into work. So the question then is, what can be done to make useful work? 2 million people, World Health Organization's widely accepted, 2 million people or more die from soot inhalation each year. And that itself is a tragedy. Millions more die from waterborne diseases. All of these issues are energy related. The soot itself comes from the fact that there aren't these useful technologies. So we looked at this question about poverty and development. Well, there's this same group of people that earn $1.25 or less a day. And we think there's something of a poverty trap. You know, it's difficult, for instance, to consider applying a legal economic theory like the Coase theory to this, because really one side of the bargaining equation can't get started because they don't have the tools to get started with. And so there really truly may be something of a poverty trap. We also know that poverty increases population. There have been some amazing studies done and some incredible work done by the United Nations to show that the way that you get a handle on the poverty issue is by getting a handle on the population issue. And the way you get a handle on the population issue is by getting a handle on the poverty issue. It's the same problem. And then we know that increased population stresses resources. You know, early on in the environmental debate, the question was, is there ultimately going to be the carrying capacity for the Earth to support all the people if we continue to have this exponential growth? And there have been huge arguments about how that works. We're not suggesting some sort of a Malthusian forecast for the world, but the fact of the matter is population does stress resources at the end of the day. Where that ultimately ends up isn't something that we need to decide for the purposes of this analysis. And on the climate change issue, black soot reduction can have huge climate change consequences. Black soot is a major contributor. It's thought to be the second largest contributor to global climate change. But it has some unique characteristics. It doesn't stay out there very long. So when you get rid of the sources of black soot, then very quickly the global climate change impacts will reverse. The same can't be said for carbon dioxide. Once the carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, it's going to be there, causing its global warming potential for about 2 decades. So the impacts of reducing carbon through CO2 are going to be seen slowly, but black soot looks like it might be a quick way to gain some foothold on the issue. And then you've got methane reduction as a possibility. Methane's energy, or a source of potential energy, and there's walloping loads of it throughout the least developed world and the developing world. All of these biological organisms, the wastes left over from harvesting, the wastes that come from animals and cattle, they all make methane. Well, naturally, that methane is a global warming gas, but it has a much greater potential to heat the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does, where carbon dioxide will last for 20 years. Methane may not last as long, but it has 20 times the global warming potential that carbon dioxide does. So transforming methane that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere into carbon dioxide is another place where we can get a huge climate change benefit. So what then are assets potential? We've already talked about the cook stoves and the tremendous cook stove project. We could eliminate 2 million deaths. I'm a lawyer, I obviously can't do math, I have an extra zero. We can also address some of these climate change issues, because we could presume, no one I think knows or has any good idea, but the use of biomass to generate useful energy is reported by the International Energy Agency as contributing over a billion tons equivalent of used energy each year around the world. Some significant fraction of that has to be used for home heating, home cooking, those kinds of things. That's a lot of biomass burning. I don't know how much biomass it is. I don't know how much black soot is being produced, but it's a lot of black soot. There's some climate change opportunities here, and we're going to come back to the economics of those in a moment. Clean water. My wife's the public works director for a small city in Bixby, and I can tell you something. Pumping water around and treating it and filtering it and cleaning it and getting it to your household is an enormously energy-intensive project. Lakshman introduced me to the Tata Swatch water filters, which I hope you've had the pleasure of him introducing it to you as well. I think there's one upstairs on the top floor. It's this amazing technology that allows for a fairly large quantity of water to be filtered for human use. Very inexpensive, very high technology, but delivered in a really simple way. You can reduce energy needs with it. Then you've also got potential really for light, for engine power, for cooking, through biogas or ethanol. All of these wastes from the production of agricultural or other kinds of systems that exist in the developing world and everywhere, they can be harnessed. There's a huge, abundant resource of energy there. Ashton, I don't know if you've looked it up on the internet, but it's an international organization that gives out prizes for folks who are working in this area who've developed some of the better technologies. You can go check out their webpage. And what they report is that it takes the waste from 2 or 3 cows to service a house for its lighting and cooking needs every day. That sounds like a potentially sustainable thing if we're able to deliver the resource of light and cooking and do it in a way that captures the methane that was already going into the atmosphere, converting it into a less harmful climate change gas. We seem to be headed in the right direction. But there's another dimension to this as well. By using readily available technologies and energy sources that are right there, that folks have access to, you enhance the sovereignty of a nation. We in the United States consider ourselves sometimes trapped in this foreign oil dilemma that we've put ourselves in what we consider to be our modern economy. Well, if an economy grows up instead, is made up instead, because some of these economies need to be grown, and that's part of the problem. If they grow up instead around the concept of using energy sources and resources that are available to them indigenously, in a way that provides for their own economic development, then that nation itself is less prone to outside impacts. They don't have to make the bad choices that were talked about at the last talk. So, and you can make electricity from this stuff too. Ethanol and biogas are easily transformed into electricity. There's a great little video, just search YouTube and you can see some guy in his backyard. He made a bio reactor and then he hooked it up to a little electric generator and he ran the generator to make electricity and lights a light bulb. It's pretty neat. It's pretty simple technology. I could even do it. So we say, well, those are the issues and those are the potentials, but what's the analysis? Where's the justification? To my knowledge and my reading, Dr. Goswami really found this and synthesized this notion in legal literature about assets and also connected it to Rawls's theories of burdened peoples and well-ordered peoples. The word that I wanted to focus on, though, out of that in terms of the analysis here is the word assist in terms of the justification. Does it assist someone who earns $1.25 a day to simply hook them up to an electric appliance or to an electric grid? It may. It very well may. And there may be very good reasons for doing that. But it also seems that using these ASATs can assist because you can build up local capacity. You can build up local economies. Folks who otherwise may not have employment can generate work and jobs around providing these new technologies. Like if you read the Ashton page, you'll see this fellow in India who created an entire little industry in India around building cook stoves in that area and employs a number of people doing it now. And we've also addressed greenhouse gases and protecting sovereignty. So we were thinking, Blake and I were thinking, when we were thinking about how to answer Dr. Goswami's analysis on this, what would be the opposite of Rawls's theory? What would be the complete opposite notion from a legal justice perspective that we could look at? And we decided, well, it probably would be egoism, right? You would only do that thing which is in your own best self-interest. Isn't that the opposite of Rawls? So then we decided, well, if we can show that the opposite legal theory also supports the use of ASATs, then we would have a firmer and perhaps more interesting justification for it. And we think we can do that. You know, the problem with the major grid analysis, putting in the big power plants and spending $1 trillion, and although it is only 3% of the world's energy infrastructure budget over the next 20 or 30 years, the problem with that is it's going to take 20 or 30 years. The people who would benefit from having access to useful work being done in their lives probably aren't alive now. So from an egoism perspective, you would want the thing done now, so you would want ASATs. You wouldn't want the grid. It can also help to reduce population growth. I'm sure you're all familiar with Dr. Hans Rosling and kind of his analysis of how population growth is linked to access to technology. I can't summarize it all in the time that I have, but if you take his analysis and you apply it here, it is somewhat cornucopian in its view, but you can support egoism with it as well. And ASATs reduce resource demands. We'll look at that in just a second. And as we discussed, they increase economic opportunities. Thermodynamics. One of the things that I think goes unsaid in all of this, and this is admittedly thermodynamics at law, but one of the things that goes unsaid is that when you generate electricity and then you transmit it to someone and then you put it into an appliance to use it to do work, like say wash your dishes, it takes 10 times the energy in the power plant burning away to generate that electricity that you actually get to make use of in your dishwasher. So if you have a technology, instead of using electricity to light a light bulb, instead if you use biogas as the base fuel to do that, you can gain double or even triple the efficiency and have a light bulb that lasts longer, have a lower global warming potential, and have greater sovereignty for your nation because you can do more with less, which means you can do more because you've only got so much. And then finally, from the economic perspective, it's probably Ayers that brings this whole notion all together. And he's an economist that really kind of focuses his thoughts around the metabolism of an economy. And so he says, look, you know, if you look kind of at this macroeconomic picture, you want to look at how an economy consumes and uses energy, efficiency being the thing that you're striving for in his view. And he coins a word for this idea of useful work. He calls it energy. In his economic perspective, clearly supports the use of assets because they provide useful work now, and they have a lower metabolism for energy than the more kind of traditional build a big power plant and ship it off to folks approach. So one last note on the economic perspective. Looking at the International Energy Agency's review on what our world will have to do to address global climate change, they predict that in the next 20 years we'll spend $15 trillion just on that issue. Most of it is going to be transforming our energy economies from a carbon-based one to something else. Well, if a developing economy starts out with something that has a better energy metabolism, and starts out using available resources that have a lower global warming potential, those economies then gain the opportunity to avoid that $15 billion in costs. And so you now make these developing countries from an economic or purely financial perspective, you don't just put them kind of at par, they get to be a step ahead because they don't have to do again in the future those things that we're having to do now. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to present these ideas to you. And Lakshman, thank you.
Jason, thank you very much. We're going to go right to the next speaker and then take questions and answers together, if you don't mind. Jason covered everything from technologies to exergy, which is a brave thing to do in one lecture. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions or comments for him. And Paul, we'll look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Thank you. And thank you for being here. And yes, it is true. The lawyer was talking about thermodynamics and the engineer is going to talk about policy. So it's not a mistake in your schedule. So I'm going to spend my time here. I'm in an unusual position. I enjoy it, but it's an unusual position in that my background and my research over the last 5 years here at CU has been predominantly with the UN, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, looking at big policy issues related to climate change and the impact on developing communities and countries. And now I'm the head of the Mortensen Center for Engineering and Developing Communities, where the focus is really to look at impacts on community level things. So trying to take these large policy issues and bring them down to communities. And from that perspective, I'm going to answer this really interesting question about what happens with, is at the end. Let's try that from the beginning. Of what happens if we don't have some of these issues. There we go. And what is the impact of energy deficits? So let's start with some really basic question. And that is, if we're going to look at this issue, what is the perspective we should look at? And Jason was talking about that in terms of this real issue of, are we talking about solving a problem right now? Are we talking about solving a problem 20 years from now? And that gets into this real vertical issue of, are we talking about individuals, communities, national, international? What are we trying to solve? And there's a real tension here because although they feed into each other, the solutions are sometimes mutually exclusive. If we try and take an asset technology, which is really designed to solve some of the individual perspectives and have immediate help, are we really solving the national or international problem? And conversely, if we're focused on that level, are we meeting the needs of the community today? And that puts us into a real question, and some of this has been addressed already, is understanding that if we take the perspective of we're only going to solve the larger problem, we have to understand that we are giving up some things. If we don't have energy at an individual level, some of the very practical things that affect people every day, we're giving up. If we don't have refrigeration, we can't have a lot of vaccines, right? If we don't have energy for illumination, we lose not only the opportunity for education, but productivity, right? We lose the ability for telecommunications, for pumping for water, right? And we need these natural resources for almost everything that we do. So the impact not only is at the individual, but it becomes long-term. This also gets into what Jason was bringing up. When we get into open fire cooking, the studies are saying it's not only dangerous from a health, but from a mental perspective. We're in that poverty trap, right? When we look at the number of people who lack access, it not only is a concern in developing countries, but there's a secondary concern which I think is largely going underreported, and that is the amount of attention and resources we're putting into it even in the industrialized countries is dropping. So what do? We've had this dilemma. Who are we trying to help? What are we trying to achieve? Who are we trying to influence? And what's the legacy? The problem is, I don't see people asking these questions enough. One of the jobs that I have is I go to companies, engineering companies predominantly, and talk to them about the importance of how they can take their knowledge, their resources, and put it to work into helping and developing some of these technologies we're talking about. And the response that I often get is, well, these are great things, but you know, we kind of like things like Habitat for Humanity, where we can kind of wear our company t-shirts and go out for the weekend and we get pictures of it. That's what our clients like. It also, we don't really have to get into some of these messy things that give us liability and all these types of things. I'm like, well, but you have the knowledge, you have the resources. Yeah, but you know, a lot of it's what does it look like on the annual report, and those things don't really play as well. It's like, okay, that's great. What they're really saying is that what they want is some short-term return. How can we do things that are clean, not messy, get short-term return, keep us out of this longer-term policy issue? And this is really what we're fighting with all the time. Because really, what we're looking at, and this is what I deal with almost on a daily basis, is when we look at large agencies on the whole, and I'm going to generalize here for just a moment, World Bank, the UN, we're talking about national and international solution, dams, power networks, highway corridors. There's less interest in that community level in terms of investment. So what does that mean is lack of funding. And I'll give you a very quick practical perspective of this. Bernard Amadei, who great individual, preceded me as director of the Mortensen Center, started Engineers Without Borders, you'll hear from him later on today, is often criticized by his own department academically because focusing on community level things don't produce enough journal articles and don't get enough grant funding. And why would you deal with that at an academic level? Now, if you could figure out how to put nanotechnology to it, it would be much more accepted from an academic perspective. Now, from an engineering perspective, I've got a real problem with that. What is our goal? Is it purely to promote careers, or is it to promote advancements in the international community? And that's a challenge that we've got to ask that question. The second part of this is really looking at it from an infrastructure perspective. Energy is one part of infrastructure, but it drives, it underpins a lot of other things that we do. And what we don't think about often enough is when we're talking about communities, we're talking about very long-term perspectives that we've got to try and integrate. Roads are a 20 to 30 year perspective. Buildings 30 to 50 years. Dams 100 years. How do we convince an agency, an organization, an engineering company that they should try and modify their perspective so that it's not always looking at the structure that's going to last 50 or 100 years and also take 10 to 20 years to design, but how do we integrate that with a need that's today? When we put that at the community level, we really have to face the fact, and this we conveniently forget, communities are really dependent on these 8 different items. Any one of these that are missing will lead to the decline in a community. Energy and infrastructure underpin all of these. We've got to get away from the approach that we often see of splitting these up. If you look at the reports that we often get and the papers that we produce, they are focused on one small part of the community impact. And I would say, in my experience, is that when you do this, you're not creating a sustainable solution. You're creating a solution that makes you feel good. You're not creating a solution that's helping the recipients. When you go in and say, I'm going to focus on just building schools, that's great. Applaud that. Except you're forgetting about the problem of if you don't deal with food security and water and energy, when is anybody going to have the time to go to the school? Right? You've got to take an interconnected focus. Now, what happens if you don't? All right? What happens to the broader legacy? And this is just an example of a lot of you know some pieces of this, statistics from Africa. These are just how much we forget in the impact. So, paved road densities. Right? If we look at low-income countries, and this is a density factor, a factor of 34 versus middle-income countries of 461. The important thing there is greater than 10 times the density of paved roads exist in just middle-income countries than the lower-income countries in Africa. Right? We predominantly miss most of the infrastructure and the energy that's required to support growth. The poverty trap, right? Some interesting statistics. My favorite ones is under phones. In many countries, more people have access to phones than piped water, right? Why? Because we know how to solve that now. We can put up cell phone towers. We skip the whole wired landlines. We give people cell phone access. It's the approach that's being done in many countries. Piped water is a complicated thing to solve. Yet how many people die from lack of access to a cell phone compared to how many people die from lack of access to piped water, right? Access to basic services. Now, the one that I want to just focus you on here just for a minute is this lower one here showing the stagnant trends. This is a very disturbing graph. When we look at electricity, when we look at each of the infrastructure elements, people in developing communities have less access or flat access than we did. We have greater technology, greater understanding, but we're going backwards. So what does that mean? It means that we're not solving the fundamental problem. This map on this side about information technology, if you look at the arrows, what are we doing? We're creating a lot of information technology linkages to Europe, to Asia, but there's nothing in the middle of the continent itself. We're forgetting to solve the infrastructure problem to the people who really need it. The water basins. Water basins are primarily a transnational problem. We need energy and electricity to actually move that water. We can't treat it as an isolated problem. Right? The road network. These are major road corridors. They're north and south along the coast. It's a leftover, let's call it, from the colonial days. We don't see a whole lot of development internally. Right? Same thing in power. Right? So what do? The needs are huge, the amount of money. But we can't focus it on just a regional. This has to be a broader focus. We need $500 million just to solve some of the regional power problems, right? Unfortunately, when we don't do this, we're reducing productivity by at least 40%. It's equal to, I like this, corruption, crime, red tape, and limited finance markets is the lack of energy. Power is the #1 most limiting factor. And I highlighted there the internet. If you want to look at something, it's not just the access, it's the ability to use technology. So how do we address this? Let's focus on this as we close out. Well, is it more funding? Is it better governance? Is it private or public? It's a combination. And the message that I want to focus on as a conclusion for you and to leave you with is we really have the ability to address a lot of this. We can focus without adding any more money. We can increase the focus on infrastructure by 50% just by some of these things, such as better planning. Now, the problem with this is how do we focus this at the community level? How do we focus this on these new asset technologies? It's not the interest that's generating the demand that we need, primarily because we're stuck in this idea that if we solve one problem, I see this with students all the time. And one of my goals is always to try and break students out of this pattern. Students like to break a problem down into small pieces. Right? They learn that. Right? They learn that every problem they get has a simple solution when they're an undergraduate. Why do we do that? It's easier to teach, right? We certainly don't want to have to face the fact of grading papers that don't have a simple solution, right? That would be horrible. Then we couldn't have graders do it, right? Then the faculty would actually have to grade the papers themselves, and then we'd have the downfall of the university. So what we need to do is focus on How do we introduce technologies that cross barriers? How do we focus on things that not only solve one problem, but answer the question of the broader legacy? As we go through and as you listen to the speakers and look at technologies, I want you to challenge people, because this is really the key. You cannot get stuck in the idea that we only need to solve things at the individual and short term. We have to balance. We have to figure out, how do we implement technologies that are not only sustainable and appropriate, but they will change the policy. They will get people to think of a longer-term solution. If we don't, we'll never get out of this situation of lack of infrastructure, because a short-term solution does not solve the deficits. It is a point-in-time solution, and we need to think about integrating that in. And with that, I'll leave that and open up to questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, Jason. Paul, maybe we'll have you sit at the table and we'll just take about 10 minutes of questions before we go to lunch. If you can formulate your interventions as questions, that would be most welcome rather than statements or comments. You have an enormous breadth of interesting subjects to draw from in those two presentations. So anyone want to start us off? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for both presentations. Were really great, very impacting and interesting. I live in Rome. I'm Tebaldo Vinciguerra, and I have several contacts with FAO. They study food security, obviously, and they never insist on the population problem. They say, yes, we have enough food. The problem is access to food. And even if population will increase, we will still have food. 30% of the food is wasted. And more or less, several policies that are trying to reduce population in some countries are, from one hand, perceived as injustice, because it's population from some countries that are consuming very small resources. And on the other hand, such policies are also perceived as counter-effective, because a very big purpose is help people adopting other patterns of consumption. So if we say part of the solution is reducing population, then you are no longer working on the solution on having responsible consumption. Then the question, if you are here to develop a new approach to adopt new patterns about energies, how do you feel with these comments? Do you think that it is really so important, useful, pertinent in your way of promoting new interesting assets? Is it important? That's it.
Thank you. Can I collect one more question before they respond? Anyone else want to chime in? Yes.
Well, I appreciate the perspectives and agree that there's no simple solution to the issues facing us. On the other hand, as a practitioner in the field, I think there's incredible opportunity in taking people on those first couple steps up a development ladder that transforms them from being in a place of constant economic and assistance need to real participants in an economy. And if I were to, suggest that maybe there is a single point or a really effective point of focus, that might be it, and I'd be curious to have you comment on that.
Thank you. That's very useful. So why don't we start with Paul, and you can take either one or any aspect of them. They're both enormous, so I'd ask you to limit your intervention.
Okay. Let me answer the second one briefly. I agree with you. I think that we've got to figure out how to get the population, local population, so that they're part of an economy. And I certainly don't mean to say that should be ignored. What my concern, and I think what we need to figure out is I want people to think about not only introducing a community to be part of an economy at one point in time, I want it to be sustainable. And my concern is that a lot of the solutions we look at, someone goes in and says, we're going to help them today, and we forget about tomorrow. And that's really the message that I want to think, but I do agree with you. Please.
Yeah, I do too as well. Picking up on the other question that you'd asked, the notion isn't actually to reduce population, but to slow population growth. If I'd said reduce population, what I meant was slow population growth. I don't think anyone has some plan to actually reduce overall world population. The notion that I've heard and have been exploring is that one of the reasons we have severe population growth is because we have, in many places, a lack of access to necessary resources like energy. And so the notion that's put forward is when you can provide those resources, then when folks have access to them, the things that cause them to have to increase their population go away. And they start transforming their economies, and then you see population growth slow. So I think the perspective's consistent, and if I misspoke, I wanted to make sure we got that straight.
Great. Excellent job covering those. We have some more comments. Luca, please.
Luca Pwanga from Regis University. I think I've got a two-part question. One is addressing the problem of population. If you look at Africa, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, population is not a problem. I mean, you can walk miles and miles, drive miles and miles, and you won't see a single soul. So that tells me that's not a problem. So how do you modify your solution from, say, if you're dealing with China and then dealing with Zambia in particular, for instance? How do you modify the solution that you're going to put in place? So that's question one. Question two is, I had your solution on, okay, here is how we should approach this. But I didn't see the pieces about the role that culture plays in those solutions.
You take first. Get dibs unless you want me to.
Well, I'll answer the second one, because I was about culture. It's a very important piece, and the role of culture in creating sustainable solutions is important, and that's one of the things. I'll do it very quickly. One of the problems that we run into, and this is as much a cultural as a political problem, is what we found over time is when you deal with infrastructure, whether it's energy infrastructure, road infrastructure, is there is a mistaken assumption by especially Western governments and engineering companies that the same cultural perspective on things like operations and maintenance occurs everywhere in the world. And it's not. We all know that. But politically, we're not really allowed to say that in some quarters because of other issues. And creating solutions that are culturally appropriate is as important as technically appropriate. And truthfully, this is a problem I think we're way behind on. I think we're much further ahead in terms of figuring out some of the technical solutions than we are in figuring out how they are culturally appropriate. And I think that's a problem that has to be put on the forefront, because I think if there's one area that I could point to that I say this is a deficit in our solution process, it's that one. And so figuring out how to bring in the local culture and not just creating a solution to impose on it is a huge part on infrastructure. And I think that's where some of these asset technologies actually have a much higher rate of success than the larger infrastructure. So the culture piece, I think, is a challenge, because I think the large organizations and large engineering companies and other companies that want to help solve it don't want to deal with it. And I think that's a problem.
Picking up it was Zambia and China. The main difference between Zambia and China, there too, is their overall geographic size and the number of people who live in the two countries. And so on the population question, it's the number of people that you start with. And what we're talking about isn't absolute necessarily numbers of people, but it's the rate of population growth. So since China is so much larger than Zambia, it has the resources and the size and the capabilities of supporting a much larger overall absolute number of people in terms of population. But if Zambia grows at a very high rate, such that its total population doubles within short periods of time, you know, a 7% growth equals roughly a doubling of the base of something every 10 years. If we have something like that happen, then you have an unsustainable situation in Zambia. You need to find too many jobs too quickly in an economy that still needs to be nurtured and grown. So you're absolutely right. Zambia and China look completely different. But the question is exactly the same. The question is, how do you make sure that as you're building up these economies, and you're doing it in a way with the people that are there, that you can do it so that the economies and the people grow in a way that's sustainable. The notion that when you look at China, China has an amazing program on these asset technologies, and a couple of things, but one that I would point out would be their small hydroelectric dams, where they've got this kind of mini hydro all over the country, and it's in large measure not connected to any other electric resource, so they're not these little mini hydros aren't part of a grid, but they just supply a town. That's a great example of an asset being delivered in that area. It's a pretty high technology asset, but it's an asset nonetheless. And it's no different than cook stoves or biogas digesters or any of these other things. So I think China and Zambia are identical with respect to the issues of population growth.
Thank you. I'm going to hold questions now. We have a few more sessions this afternoon. Before we break for lunch, just one thing to reiterate, something that happened at the very beginning, or what Kande would have said at the beginning of these sessions. It tends to happen in these sessions that you start looking at bottom-up solutions and cultural and local issues, and highlight how the issues happening at the top are not taking them into consideration. And just one thing as we move forward in the day, to consider, while that's very valid, I've never been in a country or in a village or with a government in sub-Saharan Africa or East Asia that doesn't want the precise energy services we have in this room. And in general, the women in their houses don't really want improved cook stoves. They want gas cooking and dishwashers. So it's just an interesting, it's not so subtle, it's actually hugely important. That those people really want scale, and they want scale quickly, and they want huge power systems, just like we want huge power systems in the bulk of places. And while I think on the margins and in rural communities we can agree that there are, and we can agree overall that we need these cultural ties and bottom-up solutions, it's just interesting to keep in mind when you go talk to policymakers or ministers or people in those places, they want to be able to sit in an air-conditioned room with beautiful frequency happening, and the laws of physics apply directly to sub-Saharan Africa as they do here. So with that, thank you very much. It's a fascinating couple of people, a fascinating set of interventions, and we're going to take lunch, I believe, for about an hour, and then come back to session 3, where you have the delight of hearing from both Dr. Andrew Yeager and Martin Hiller, who are old friends of mine from the UN, so we'll look forward to hearing from you both after lunch. Thank you.